Right, if we're all ready, I think we should begin. And it's very nice to be chairing this meeting rather than having to talk. And it's my great pleasure to introduce a member of the home team here, S. Siddharth, who's going to talk about examining the concept of intelligence, which is obviously a very key and contentious matter in education. And I'm sure we greatly look forward to hearing what Siddharth has to say. So, please. Oh, he's going to talk for 35 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for discussion, conversation.
Hello. Hello. Yeah, my paper mainly wants to examine the concept of intelligence. It's going to take a multidisciplinary view. I'll start off with the conception of intelligent as has been conceived in psychology, and I shall move on. I don't have a presentation, I'll just read out my paper. The concept of intelligence has been and is still of interest to scholars of many fields: psychology, sociology, computer science, and philosophy, among others. To students of education, it is of central concern, for it influences and affects our understanding of the nature and character of the human mind, the development of which is an important aim of education in the liberal view. At a more fundamental level, as far as we know, it is only human beings who take up this endeavor of education. Hence, a deeper understanding of the intelligent nature of human beings is necessary, upon which we can build our understanding of education. So, what is intelligence? In daily as well as scholarly usage, one suspects we use it to mean different things. When I say human beings are intelligent while computers are not, and when I say X is more intelligent than Y, am I using the word in the same sense? A conceptual analysis of intelligence should help us understand the term better and the assumptions and premises that underpin our understanding of the term. In this paper, I seek to build a theoretical understanding of the concept. In the first section, I shall begin by looking at various conceptions of intelligence proposed in the discipline of psychology, and shall proceed to explore and understand the philosophical underpinnings of these conceptions. The purpose is primarily exploratory, to understand the essence of the concept as conceived in these definitions. In section 2, it is argued that these definitions do not take into account agency, which is a necessary manifestation of any entity that can be qualified as intelligent. Further, in the last section, it is argued that for any entity to be intelligent, it will have to possess the property of phenomenal consciousness. Two arguments from the same are explored. First, drawing upon the conception of knowledge in the domain of epistemology, and the second drawing on empirical research done on the role of emotions and feelings in the discipline of neurosciences. I shall also draw upon ideas from the philosophy of mind and artificial intelligence. So to begin with the psychological view, the concept itself has been a topic of debate for scholars for a long time. Some in despair, it would seem, have even concluded that intelligence is what intelligent tests test. However, we now have a more nuanced psychological understanding of the concept. Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, chose to define intelligence not in terms of any particular functions or mental structures that were to be the threshold of intelligence, on crossing which one could be qualified as intelligent, but along a continuum. To quote Piaget, open quotes, "It is still possible to define intelligence by the direction towards which its development is turned, without insisting on the question of boundaries, which becomes a matter of stages or of successive forms of equilibrium. We can therefore regard the matter from the point of view of both the functional situation and of the structural mechanism. From the first of these points of view, we can say that behavior becomes more intelligent as the pathways between subject and object on which it acts cease to be simple and become progressively more complex. Thus, perception only requires simple paths, even if the object perceived is very remote. A habit might seem more complex, but its spatio-temporal articulations are welded into a unique whole with no independent or separable parts. An act of intelligence, such as finding a hidden object or recognizing the meaning of a picture, involves a certain number of paths which can be both isolated and synthesized. Thus, from the point of view of the structural mechanism, elementary sensory-motor adaptations are both rigid and unidirectional, while intelligence tends towards reversible mobility. Thus, as we shall see, it is the essential property of the operations which characterize living logic in action. But we can straight away see that reversibility is the very criterion of equilibrium. To define intelligence in terms of progressive reversibility of the mobile structures which it forms is therefore to repeat, in different words, that intelligence constitutes the states of equilibrium towards which tend all successive adaptations of a sensory motor and cognitive nature, as well as all assimilatory and accommodatory interactions between the organism and the environment. This is where the quote ends. I'm sorry for the slightly long quote. Hence, Piaget did not identify any minimum functional capability or complexity of mental structures of a behavior of an organism or the organism's behavior to qualify it as intelligent, but rather defined it as the capacity for a succession of adaptations, that is, equilibriums between assimilation and accommodation. Intelligence was only a general term to indicate, to quote Piaget, the superior forms of organization or equilibrium of cognitive structuring. Close quotes. It could never be defined in absolute terms, but only in relation to the development of an organism's cognitive structures. A person could thus be described as being more intelligent than he was yesterday, but not as being intelligent in a general absolute sense. As Piaget himself identifies, such a conception also assumes continuity among various human functions. This also assumes that there is a general law of development that would qualify one state of equilibrium as more developed or intelligent than another. Moving on to more recent conceptions of the term, Sarah Meadows, a developmental psychologist, observes that currently there is a degree of agreement on the discourse on what intelligent behavior is. To quote her, both Lighty and psychologist experts believe that intelligent persons will have good vocabularies, read with good comprehension, talk fluently and sensibly, make good decisions, plan well, be able to apply their knowledge to problems, determine how best to achieve goals, be interested in things around them, etc., while less intelligent persons will show fewer of these characteristics. One can notice that intelligence here, according to Meadows, has been defined completely in terms of competences of the individual, while observing that the constitution or what forms this set of competences might vary with culture. The factors that might explain the acquisition of the competences in themselves are not part of the conception of intelligence. Sternberg, who takes the multicultural approach forward, summarizes that the concept is understood differently across different cultures. For example, while Western societies emphasize on speed of mental processing and depth of processing, other cultures tend to include different competences, like the Chinese, who he felt included more of non-verbal and verbal reasoning ability and rote memory, while some African communities tend to include those skills that help facilitate and maintain harmonious intergroup and intragroup relationships. Sternberg and Grigorenko hence opine that intelligence considered outside its cultural context would only be a myth. However, they felt that it may vary across cultures but was still a set of competences. However, it is possible that these competences that are seen as constituting intelligence may all be manifestation of a deeper and different faculty. Such a deeper faculty was what Charles Edward Spearman conceptualized as the measure of general intelligence, or G as it is called. It may be defined as the common element present in a diverse set of intellectual measures that are positively related to each other. Intelligence tests, or IQ tests as they are known, measure the G of an individual in comparison to others of the same age who take the test. Such a conception was based on observation that people who excel in one type of intellectual tasks tend to excel in other types of intellectual tasks as well. However, there have been many arguments against such a single deeper faculty of intelligence. Meadows quotes psychologist Michael Ho when she says that intelligence, whether measured by a simple psychophysiological task or by somewhat more complex tasks involving learning, problem solving or reasoning, or by traditional intelligence tests, remains an unspecified composite of knowledge, skills, strategies and personality qualities, not necessarily the same from one individual to another or from one test to another, and certainly not an innate cognitive ability. However, this only takes us back to intelligence as a cocktail of competences or characteristics. Michael Hand, a philosopher of education, points out the problems with such a conception of intelligence in terms of competences. Hand opines that the relative ease or difficulty with which one acquires a competence would indicate how intelligent or not an individual is, or not just whether one possesses the competence at all or not. Hence, Hans propounds that, to open quotes, the quality of mind picked out by the term intelligence is a species of aptitude. Aptitudes stand in an important logical relation to competences, but are nevertheless sharply distinct from them. Grasping this relation and this distinction is the key to understanding the logic of everyday discourse about intelligence. To have an aptitude, on the other hand, is not necessarily to be capable of giving good or correct performances. A person may have an aptitude for something without yet being able to do it well. Ascriptions of aptitudes are not claims about the possession of competences, but claims about the ease with which competences are acquired. Thus, such a conception would render IQ tests meaningless, for they only measure the current level of competence and not one's ease of acquiring it. Next, Hand also argues that the faculty of the mind that intelligence picks out is the aptitude for theorizing. By theories, he refers to mean the wide variety of cognitive constructions by which human beings plan, govern, and justify their actions and organize, narrate, and explain their experiences. The kind of competences that we usually describe as intelligence, usually intellectual, require a higher amount of theorizing than competences in physical activities like sports, and hence the aptitude for the former would better indicate one's intelligence than the aptitude for the latter. This is Hand's argument. The purpose of the above exercise was to get an idea of the various ways intelligence has been conceptualized in psychology. To summarize, the conceptions we have seen so far have been in terms of one or a combination of the following. 1. A set of competences that may or may not vary with culture. 2. A deeper fundamental cognitive ability that underlies all competences that may or may not be innate. Intelligence relatively defined in terms of development of mental equilibriums as Piaget did. Aptitude, that is, how quickly one can pick up competences, especially in intellectual competences. All of these seem to assume that whether intelligence is a product of nature or nurture is not a part of the essence of the concept. This is captured by Hand when he states that intelligence might be innate or fixed, but is not innate or fixed by definition. Even for Piaget, intelligence is only a term to indicate a superior form of equilibrium of cognitive structuring. The factors that affect, gave rise to, and explain these equilibriums were not themselves essential to the definition of intelligence. Given a set of mental structures, its ability for adaptation, that is, to assimilate or accommodate what the external world presented the entity with in progressive equilibriums, was what made the entity intelligent, not the factors that explain the adaptation itself. This brings us to a deeper philosophical question on the nature of human intelligence. If what brings about the development of aptitude, competences, or these equilibriums is irrelevant to its definition, then what is the difference between the intelligence of humans and intelligence of machines? Can a computer, at least in theory, attain these competences or the ability for adaptation of its cognitive structures? Or are some of these uniquely human? If the latter, what aspect of these competences differentiate humans from computers? What is it that qualitatively distinguishes human intelligence from that of a computer? In the next section, I argue that it is agency that differentiates us from machines, something that is not considered in any of the definitions of intelligence considered above. In these conceptions, to repeat, to learn from the environment or the result of in these conceptions, intelligence could have been the result of an innate biology, a set of rules hardwired into the system of the entity that enabled it to learn from the environment, or the result of agentic actions of the entity. Which of these, however, as Hand observed, is irrelevant to the definition of intelligence in itself. It is this assumption that I would like to argue against. The next section, where I shall argue that agency is a necessary manifestation of intelligence. The idea that there is no qualitative difference between human and computer intelligence is counterintuitive and an opposition to our daily experiences. To begin with, human beings feel emotions, often act with a sense of purpose, make judgments about abstract notions like appropriateness, and indulge in tricks like deception and humor, things we do not usually associate with computers. However, though as a matter of fact, it may or may not be possible to implement rule-based algorithms and programs to replicate all of these. It is still not impossible though. The single biggest difference between human and computer intelligence, I opine, is that humans have the capacity for agency while machines do not. Every action of a computer, as we now know it, is explained and determined by its hardware and software, even if based on the machine's interaction with the outside world, it were to acquire any competence, every action of a computer would be fully determined by its hardware and software, which we could broadly compare to as the nature of the computer and the history of its interactions. In principle, knowing the exact details of these three elements would be able to determine and predict its action in any given situation. On the other hand, even if all human individuals are bestowed with the same fixed biology and the same history of social interactions and exposure to external environment, there is nothing determinate about one's action and the choices one makes. In our everyday life, one has the experience that our most actions are results of conscious will, that we are agents and not just the structure. By structure here, I mean the biology and any factors external to the individual's mind, including the history of social interactions. So we have the experience that we are conscious agents and not just the structure playing out. We have the conscious experience of being agents and causing actions. The capacity for action is what is referred to as agency. Human actors are different because there is nothing inevitable about most of our actions. That is, an action is not the only way it could have been. As Fuchs says, actions are contingent, but behavior is necessary. And in the case of human beings, it's mostly actions. Actions are contingent to our will and the choices we make. There are no absolute causes for any of our actions, but only reasons that can partly explain them. Intelligence, as I understand, is that characteristic of an individual or entity for which only the individual is responsible. One cannot be held responsible for one's biology or the social environment that one is exposed to. For us, has been already been noted, these are outside the individual's control. It is one's agency as it manifests in the structural setting of the individual it is only this that is attributable to the individual. Here, I would like to draw attention to the observations of philosopher Fred Dretske, who notes that intelligence requires that behavior is controlled and explained fully only by reference to what the entity thinks and the contents of those thoughts. To quote him, what is required for intelligence is not only this, that is either competences or goal-oriented actions, but behavior that is governed by the reasons that rationalize it. It requires doing something because it is thought to be a means to some desired end. If the thought plays no role in the production of the behavior, then however useful such behavior might be, it does not, even when accompanied by the thought, count as intelligence. We can, if we like, thank evolution for designing automatic reflexes that prevent injury, but we cannot thank ourselves. If this is to be counted as an intelligent arrangement, it's Mother Nature and not me who gets credit for the intelligence. When Dretske says that for an action to qualify as intelligent, it will have to be necessarily explained by the contents of one's thought, I understand that he means it is not enough that the thought is epiphenomenal. That is, the thought just always accompanies the action, but it needs to have a causal impact. For the behavior to be intelligent, it should not just be caused by a thought that has the right content, but because it has the right content. Only then can the entity get credit for the intelligence. I would like to add on to this and say that to qualify an entity as intelligent, it is not enough that the content of its thought explain its behavior and action, but these thoughts in themselves can fully be explained only in terms of the choices the entity makes, and not just the factors beyond the control of the entity. These choices that one makes is what I understand by agency, for it is only these that the entity gets the credit for. It is this capacity for agency that I conceive of as intelligence. At this point, it is worth noting that all conscious human actions are agentic, even if they serve to reproduce the structures the individual is operating within. Strictly speaking, it may be meaningless to talk of one action being more agentic than others, or an individual not possessing agency. What such statements probably mean is that one's agency serves to reproduce the structures. It is an agentic act nevertheless. That all human actions, including those habits reproducing structural characteristics, are agentic has been noted by sociologists as well. For example, Emirbayer and Miche, who say that we claim that even habitual action is agentic, since it involves attention and effort. Such activity is largely unreflective and taken for granted. However, they choose to call it iteration rather than structure because they want to stress that it is still agency, and it is this dimension of agency that is often most difficult to conceive of in properly agentic terms. Psychologists have studied the role of agency in cognitive development, though they have not defined intelligence in terms of agency. When we once again look at Piaget's conception of intelligence, he takes reversibility to be the hallmark of intelligence. To understand reversibility, let us take the example that another Piagetian, Russell, uses. When a cat crosses me, the way I perceive the world is world dependent. I cannot perceive the cat crossing again unless the cat actually crosses me again, and in the order in which it occurs. However, in some cases, like when I'm going through a book, the order of perception is dependent on my action. Piagetians theorize that human beings possess this characteristic of reversibility on account of being agents. Agency, though, is not central to their notion of intelligence, but only a factor in explaining how intelligence in human beings develop. Reversibility, in principle, could be implemented by a set of rules without any references to choices or judgments that an individual makes. However, as I conceptualize intelligence, it is not the capacity for reversibility, but the ability to choose and make judgments that is the essence of intelligence. To summarize, it is in the sense of possessing agency that human beings are intelligent in a way computers are not. What I say when I say that human beings are intelligent and computers are not, I say that human beings act as agent, while every action of a computer is fully caused by factors external to the computer itself. Human actions are mostly explained only by reference to their thought and the choices they make, and not just their biology or social history. This now raises the question of whether such intelligence is possible without certain other characteristics of the human mind, most notably consciousness. By consciousness, I refer to the property of the human mind by which it is something it is like to have an experience. To differentiate between this from other usages of the term consciousness, it is often referred to as phenomenal consciousness. I shall use the word standalone, just consciousness. Even earlier when I used the term conscious will, what I meant was I was referring to one subjective phenomenal experience of willing something. If the capacity for thought were necessary for intelligence, can an entity think and hence be intelligent without being conscious? It is this question that I shall turn to in the next section. Phenomenal consciousness is an element that characterizes every moment of our waking life and an integral part of our experience that it is often easy to overlook it. All human beings, it would seem, are conscious and intelligent. However, is the latter necessary for the former? At the outset, I would like to differentiate between decisions and judgments. A decision is a conclusion arrived at following a set of discrete rules and criteria. Decision sciences involve the study of tools like linear programming, wherein given a set of inputs and criteria, one can arrive at a unique set of output and only that output. On the other hand, a judgment, while taking into consideration certain rules and criteria, are not bound by them. Conclusions arrived at by human beings are often judgments. One might have a set of criteria that guide our thought process, but they do not bind us. One might, if one so chooses, flout one or many of these rules to arrive at a different judgment. A judgment is the conclusion of an agent, while a decision is the output of an algorithm. As human beings, we arrived at judgments based on reflection and introspection, experiences that presuppose phenomenal consciousness. However, while it is seen that human judgments and hence human intelligence are dependent on our capacity for conscious experience, this still does not show that the latter is necessary for the former, but only that it is one of the many possible ways to facilitate judgments. Here, and hence, I would like to look at two possible and short arguments that sort of indicate us towards that the capacity for phenomenal consciousness is necessary for intelligence, not as a matter of concept, but as a matter of fact. The first, I'd like to borrow from the discipline of epistemology. I would like to begin from the premise that any intelligent action is not possible without knowledge. In other words, the capacity for knowledge is a necessary condition for intelligence. While the jury is still out on what constitutes knowledge, a popular understanding, of course, being the tripartite analysis of knowledge as justified true belief, one can agree that knowledge is necessarily constituted by a belief. But what exactly is a belief? Lawrence Bonjour talks of two kinds of belief that could constitute knowledge. Number one, an occurrent belief, which is what happens when the person has the proposition explicitly in mind and accepts or assents to it. And number two, a dispositional belief, where the person does not have the proposition explicitly in mind, but is disposed to accept or assent to it, that is, would accept or assent to it if the issue were raised. Further, he adds that with regards to dispositional beliefs, it should be specified instead as the dispositional state in which, number one has previously explicitly considered and consciously accepted or assented to the proposition in question. Number two, as a direct result of this prior acceptance or assent, would accept or assent to it again if the question were explicitly raised. In occurrent beliefs, it is clear that any belief is ontologically a subjective, phenomenally conscious state of the mind. In the case of a dispositional belief, while one may not consciously hold the proposition in one's mind, one should have held it consciously in the past. Hence, to hold a belief is to have a phenomenal experience of believing in a proposition, not merely being disposed to assenting to the proposition when asked. It would hence seem that if knowledge were constituted by beliefs, knowledge, as we currently understand it, would not be possible without phenomenal consciousness. If knowledge were necessary for intelligence, it would in turn imply that consciousness is necessary for intelligence as well. The second line of argument that I'd like to refer to borrows from empirical research in neurosciences on the role of emotions and feelings in our ability to reason. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio argues that the popular notion that reasoning in its purest form ought to be unaffected by emotions and feelings is something he does not agree with, and he wants to argue against it. In his study of individual whose specific section of the brain has been damaged, Damasio found that the damage has two-pronged impact. First, it left the patients with flat emotions and feelings, and second, it had a debilitating effect on the ability of the patients to reason, make judgments, and plan for the future. Talking about one of the patients, Damasio recounts, open quote, "I also had a strong suspicion that the defect in emotion and feelings was not an innocent bystander next to the defect in social behavior. Troubled emotions probably contributed to the problem. I began to think that the cold-bloodedness of the patient's reasoning prevented him from assigning different values to different options and made his decision-making landscape hopelessly flat." Close quotes. It is possible that the capacity for emotions and reason are only correlated, both resulting from a more fundamental cause, implying that emotions by themselves are not necessary for an individual to be able to reason. However, Damasio himself seemed to think otherwise. Emotion and feeling, along with the covert physiological machinery underlying them, assist us with the daunting task of predicting an uncertain future and planning our actions accordingly. Damasio certainly did consider emotions and feelings necessary for the human ability to reason. If one were to assume that the ability to reason and make judgments were a necessary manifestation of intelligence, it would seem that emotions and feelings are necessary for intelligence. When Damasio talks of feelings, he refers to the phenomenal experience, or what is also sometimes referred to as qualia, that accompanies emotions, how it feels to be sad or happy for the subject of the emotions. Hence, it would seem that if one were to accept Damasio's argument, phenomenal consciousness is necessary for intelligence as a matter of fact. Other philosophers have made similar observations. Fred Dretske, while exploring the use and necessity of consciousness, refers to empirical research done in cases of blindsighters. Blindsighters are people who, due to brain damage, have lost their capacity of vision in certain parts of the visual field. However, when asked if there were a particular object in their blinded area of the visual field, they were able to answer correctly more often than a fully blind person in principle would be able to. In some sense, to quote Dretske, in some sense, blindsighters seem able to see the fact, at least they receive information about what the facts are, that there is, say, an X and not an O on the right, without being able to see the objects on the right. No qualia or no phenomenal experience, but they seem to be getting some sort of information input. Describes Dretske. It seems like the function of vision was being fulfilled without the accompanying phenomenal experience of seeing. However, while these patients were able to sense the presence of these objects, at least more often than people with no vision could, to quote Dretske, all these subjects lacked the ability to think about or imagine the objects that they could respond to in another mode, or to interrelate them in space and in time, and this deficiency can be crippling. Though, in a forced situation, the patients could sense the presence of objects, they could not use this sensory knowledge in their everyday life. Often, they kept bumping into lampposts and other objects. In a sense, it could be said that while they could sense the presence of objects, they did not have the belief, or rather could not form the belief on which they could ground their actions and use this knowledge. Certain kinds of reasoning based on visual perception that normal human beings seemed capable of, these blindsighters seemed incapable of. This seems to point us towards a possible role that phenomenal consciousness plays in human intelligence. One last point that I'd like to reiterate. While the arguments from empirical research seem to indicate the necessary function that phenomenal consciousness plays in human intelligence, it would only be as a matter of fact that consciousness is necessary for intelligence, not as a conceptual necessity. As Dretske notes, maybe something else besides experience would enable us to do the same things, but this would not show that experience did not have a function at all in the first place. So just to conclude my paper, first we saw that psychologists have mostly understood intelligence as referring to either one or a combination of the following, that is a fundamental cognitive ability, a set of competences, or an aptitude for whatever set of competences, and an ability to form mental structures and progress through an equilibrium of mental structures. Piaget, while studying the role of agency in cognitive development of children, does not define intelligence essentially in terms of agency. However, if one were to look at intelligence as an achievement that ought to be attributable only to an individual, The characteristic of a mind picked out by intelligence would be its capacity for agency. It is seen that from the discipline of epistemology and neurosciences that there are prima facie reasons to believe that if our conception of intelligence considers the ability to possess knowledge and to make reasoned judgments to be its necessary manifestations, the capacity for phenomenal consciousness is a necessary condition for intelligence. Hence, along with agency and the conscious nature of the human mind would have to be further examined closely to understand the nature of the entity that we seek to develop in our endeavor education. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very professional run-through of various positions and problems in the area. And just before I open it up to the floor, could I just press you on one point? I'm sure that there are connections, possibly conceptual connections, between intelligence and reasoning and consciousness. But it seems to me that in many manifestations of intelligence, or what we would call intelligent behavior, and I think correctly, there's no reasoning of any explicit sort, no decision-making of any explicit sort, and possibly no consciousness of what I'm doing. So I'd just like to ask, to press you a little bit on the connection with habitual action and these other dispositions that you've spoken about. Let me just give an example. Suppose I'm driving. Now, I drive, but I never know explicitly what I'm doing, I don't think. I'm not conscious usually of making decisions, and yet I think my driving could be characterized either as stupid, probably is stupid, or intelligent. But obviously if it can be characterized as stupid, it could be characterized as intelligent, because they're polar opposites. So suppose I'm driving along and a child jumps out of the road in front of me. I immediately swerve and brake, and somebody says to me, "That was a very intelligent bit of driving. What did you do?" And I say, "I don't know." But I think that's a not uncommon experience. And yet we would want to say that was an intelligent bit of driving. And the same with playing cricket or tennis or these things. Yes. Well, it is know-how, yes. But the point I'm trying to make is that maybe in these cases there's no kind of explicit consciousness, no explicit decision.
Yeah, that's true. But I would still think that at that one particular incident, a person might not have consciously held the belief that I need to stop the car now. But still his behavior is not rule-based. It is still possible that in the past, sometime the driver would have consciously held a belief that in such a case that I need to stop, or to have considered the possibility at all. So this is, I think, in some ways related to what Bonjour called dispositional beliefs. So it is still possible that at some time he would have considered and had a belief and consciously considered that in such a contingency I need to stop. That is one. And the second thing is that even at the moment that he did stop, that is not the only way it could have been. It is still possible for the driver to have consciously considered not stopping and gone on to do so. And hence, I'd like to think that this is an intelligent action, because there is nothing inevitable about that. Unlike, say, in a rule-based mechanism.
Yeah, well, I'd agree with you. There's nothing inevitable about it. But I think in that case, if I'd had to be thinking and making a decision, I would have done the wrong thing, because it would have been too late. But anyway, yes. Yes. The lady there. Oh, no, I think Randall.
Yeah, you have used the term phenomenal consciousness, right? In which context you have spoken this? Either it is a knowledge or intelligence, or else it is a mind. And one more question, you have spoken about agency. You told that it doesn't refer to intelligence, right? It refers to the habitual actions. And without our innate qualities or without intelligence, how can we refer to the habitual actions? Habitual actions depends on our intelligence.
Answering your second question, as to agency, habitual actions, I'm telling that we have many habitual actions that might help us fulfill certain goals. But my argument is that it is not these goal-oriented, the capacity for such goal-oriented habits that make us intelligent, but that even in that moment of habit, it is possible that we could have consciously considered and acted in a different way or made a conscious choice. That is what I refer to as the agency. And that is what makes us intelligent. I mean, a simple parallel would be that there could be, in principle, machines which solve extremely complicated problems, but it is not this goal-oriented or success-oriented actions that make us intelligent, because that, I mean, and a habit, as Dretske points out, is still something, or an instinct rather, not a habit. An instinct is still something that we need to thank evolution for, not us ourselves. So if at all something is an intelligent arrangement, there it is evolution and not the individual. That is his argument, and I tend to concur with that. As for your first question regarding phenomenal consciousness, I refer to the general, a property of the mind, the fact that we have qualitative mental states. Like any pain, or whenever I'm looking at you, it feels some way to look at you. So this, I argue, as a matter of fact, based on certain empirical research, that this is presupposed for human intelligence. That it is the capacity for phenomenal consciousness that facilitates human intelligence.
So it's a nice exploration in what I would think of as philosophical psychology. Is it also an exploration in philosophy of education, I wonder? I mean, do you think the analysis you've given us drives any implications? I mean, the standard debates that aren't just strictly psychometric about the construct validity of general intelligence are about things like the use of intelligent tests in defining a baseline of expected school performance against which children would then be judged to have specific learning disabilities. I mean, is there some way the analysis you've given us enters into, helps inform any debates about education as such?
This is something that I also thought about, that the implications for education might not seem immediately, I mean, it's not something that we can see immediately. But what sort of motivated me to explore this is that I think the broad consensus seems to be that intelligence or something, I mean, other words that are interchangeably used like merit, are something that needs to be rewarded, and that we seek to be measured. So philosophical and of course informed by sociological research as well, an understanding of the concept of intelligence, I mean, would help us identify what exactly is it that we seek to reward. So as you said, if, I mean, like IQ tests are used for, to use as a benchmark, if not reward, then at least classify people. But what does the IQ test actually measure? And does this agree with our conception of intelligence? If our conception of intelligence is agency, the capacity for agency, an IQ test does not test that. So since intelligence is a concept that is central to in our educational practice, because it's seen as something that is that needs to be rewarded, I wanted to explore this. But as you pointed out, the implications for education are not immediate, but two things I could think of are, number one, you need to understand the context of any individual before you make an evaluation. And by understanding the context, it is something I say, if it is only agency that you want to reward, then you need to understand broadly the structure, which as I conceive includes the biology and the social history of the person. And understanding that is something very complex, and how you do it is of course open for debate. So one needs to understand what exactly one needs to reward in education in practice. The second is that I mean, to understand the linkage between what drives a person to perform any action and to reason, which I seem to think is that is our feelings or the qualia of that is associated with emotions. So we cannot really draw a very sharp line between emotions and reasoning or feelings and reasoning. And that I think would have some import for education.
Your exploration was very well done. Yet this area is very complex. So I was wondering, in an age when we have created robots and even cars which can cross hurdles, take decisions like they change their step when a different terrain comes and can move across a variety of hurdles and all. One, would you call that also agency? I mean, when something unexpected comes and the machine takes an action which is not actually necessarily algorithmic, would you call it agency? One. Two is, would you call instincts algorithmic? Three, I personally think, or this is actually not an original idea, but I've heard somewhere that the very special thing about human consciousness is its ability to recoil upon itself. It can reflect on itself. It can look at itself. Even if you came across, a child jumped in front of your car and you stopped, but you would be able to reflect back, think about it, and explain your action, whether in future, whether in past, or whether current. So it's like, this is the special thing about human consciousness, which probably other consciousnesses do not possess. What's your comment?
The first question about your about machines being intelligent. Again, my exposure to the field is very limited, but I would think, I mean, I don't know, but as far as I know, all machines are either algorithmic or in some way rule-based. I'm not very clear about my exposure to the field, of course, is very, very limited. But does it really have a choice to have acted in that way? And could it have, in a different parallel universe, if I may say so, not acted the way it did, everything else remaining the same? If it did, if it could have acted another way, then it is an agent. But I don't know as a matter of fact whether agency is possible in machines now. That is, of course, in the domain of artificial intelligence. So, but if there is no question of choice involved, however complicated the problem that the machine seeks to solve and does indeed solve, it is still the intelligence of the person who has programmed it or built the machine rather than the machine itself, which sort of carries over to instincts as well. What Dretske feels is that if instincts is not something you choose, if somebody is coming to hit you and you instinctively move your head or instinctively don't move and still it is not something you chose, the instinct, I mean, the intelligent design of the instinct is something you need to plan. I mean, you need to credit evolution for, not the individual himself or herself. And I tend to concur with that. And the third part was self-referentiality of consciousness. So, yeah, I think philosophers tend to think that self-reference or self-awareness is a necessary part of at least human consciousness. But my argument was more that phenomenal consciousness, which is not just self-awareness, but I mean, possession of what is called qualia, or some way it feels to be in a particular mental state. I don't think I can add on more. My knowledge of that is limited.
Got time for one more question. Yes. Well, actually, if you both ask questions, write it back very, very quickly.
Yeah.
One sentence each, and then maybe.
All right. You shared about knowledge as justified true beliefs. So I'm not like countering the importance of agency as such, but when we say knowledge and knowledge construction, so you mentioned about Piaget taking equilibrium as the movement towards learning and knowledge construction. So in that case, the errors that humans make, Piaget was also interested in that, the errors, they are more like very creative, the errors that we make, right? So I just wanted to understand your take on, isn't that also socially influenced?
I'm wondering whether you're using the word intelligence in two different ways. Because if you think of it as the capacity for agency, then we get the idea that human beings are in general intelligent, period. That's it. We all have the capacity for agency. That doesn't give you anything graded of the sort of thing that would assign merit or anything like that, which would simply suggest that we've got an ambiguity here. If she's more intelligent than I am, then she's got more of something, but probably that's not more agency. But she does have something worth crediting.
Thank you.
Yeah, the first question for the role of errors as Piaget saw it. Yeah, it is socially affected. But, I mean, the person who commits the error, as I understand, is still intelligent because he could have chosen, I mean, his mental action or his thoughts could have been different such that he or she does not commit the error. So, I'm not sure, yeah, the error could, I mean, there is a social explanation to it, but the social history still does not determine the error. It is not the only way it could have been. So, that is my clarification. And as for intelligence, agency, and I mean the confusion in the terms, yes, if the way I conceive of intelligence as being agentic, yes, it is, if at all you are crediting anything, I mean ideally it is only the agency of the individual that you want to credit for. Because if you want to credit and reward a competence, and what explains the acquisition of the competence could be many other factors other than the agency as well. But those are not something you can hold the individual responsible for. I mean, of course, this is an argument, and how do you evaluate and differentiate between what is the structural manifestation and what is the agentic manifestation when you are evaluating a competence is, of course, a very difficult task. But as an in-principle argument, that's what I would think. But yeah, as you said, all human beings are intelligent, most human actions are agentic. So we need to, with that understanding of intelligence, we need to sort of reevaluate what we seek to reward in education. Is it intelligence or is it competence? If you say that it is competence I want to reward, then you're sort of accepting that I want to reward the structure that goes behind explaining the competence as well.